Hello, everyone. We have indeed made it to Friday, which is, I don't know, it always goes fast. I feel like I blink and it goes from being Tuesday to being Friday. So yeah, I'm going to talk about workflows today. So the title of my talk is Simplify Your Science with Workflow Tools. And that's kind of the goal here, is to help you come up with ways to maybe streamline your processes and the things that you work on. So I've got a problem. It's a pretty big problem. I need to simulate about 600,000 different earthquakes in Southern California. And it turns out I want to know what the impact is from all of these earthquakes at a bunch of different locations. I want to measure how much the ground will move. So in the end, I'm going to have something like 420 million different seismograms, different little wiggles, that I want to keep track of. In order to calculate all of these seismograms, it's going to take me about 26 million different computational tasks. So I have a pretty big workload ahead of me. Now you might say, okay, wait a minute, why are you doing this? Why do you need to simulate so many earthquakes? 600,000 earthquakes are not going to occur anytime soon. And you'd be right. It turns out that, say you're trying to build a building in downtown Los Angeles and you want to know how strong your building needs to be. Well, unfortunately, we don't have that almanac yet, right? You can't pull out the almanac and say, well, I see here that a magnitude 6.4 earthquake is going to occur near my building on Tuesday, July 27th, 2042. So I should probably be prepared for that one. There are a lot of smart people working on that problem, but we haven't figured it out yet. So, but this kind of information would be really useful, not just for people who are building buildings, but also if, for example, you're trying to set earthquake insurance rates. Or maybe you're just wanting to do disaster planning exercises and you want to know what areas should be most concerned about what might happen in an earthquake. So since we can't use this handy-dandy non-existent almanac, instead what we do is we take a look at kind of all the possible earthquakes that might occur in the future, and we use the best available science approach, which is to run a wave propagation simulation for each of these 600,000 earthquakes and figure out how much shaking each of them would cause at, say, our hypothetical building in downtown Los Angeles. And then what we can do is we can combine the amount of shaking that each earthquake causes with the probability that each earthquake happens, and we can end up with something that we call a hazard curve, like what you see here. And so basically the x-axis here is shaking. The units are acceleration in terms of gravity, so that 1.25 Gs is quite a lot. But we do see up to about 2.5 Gs in the most extreme earthquakes, which is something to think about. And then the y-axis is the probability in a log scale. So this makes sense, right? Essentially, we have a high probability of not very much shaking, and then we trail off to a low probability of a lot of shaking. And the exact shape of this curve and where you go on this curve depends on whether you're building, say, a skyscraper or a hospital or a nuclear power plant. This is for one place, right? This is for our building in downtown LA. We could then repeat this for lots of different locations, represented by triangles on this map, and we could produce what's called a hazard map that gives us a sense of the seismic risk in a whole region. So hopefully I've managed to convince you that my problem is worth solving, and I should come up with a way to do it. So let's talk about what are the computational challenges and issues that come up with trying to do this. So one is automation, right? I mentioned I've got 26 million tasks that need to run. I can't sit there and do 26 million S-batch commands, right? I've got to have some way to automate this. There's the data management challenges. I told you I'm going to have 420 million seismograms. So I need to keep track of all of this data and also keep track of all the input files needed to generate it. There are challenges related to job execution. Those 26 million tasks are many different kinds of jobs. Some of them are serial, some of them are parallel. Some of them are CPU, some of them are GPU, but I need to somehow have a way to get them all onto nodes that will run them. And lastly, with this many files and this many jobs, things are going to fail sometimes. It would be nice if I had some kind of resiliency to common problems that I encounter, so things don't just blow up if the file system is having a hiccup that day. So we at the Statewide California Earthquake Center, or SCEC for short, decided to use scientific workflows to help us mitigate these various challenges. We selected a particular pair of open source tools that work well together. They're called Pegasus WMS. The WMS stands for Workflow Management System. People usually just call it Pegasus. And HT Condor. Sometimes people still call it Condor. There was a trademark issue about 5 or 6 years ago, so they had to rename it, but people are slow to change. So the way that we express our work then is as a directed graph, right? So this is like circles and boxes with arrows of tasks that we want to run and dependencies between them, right? One task has to run first, and then once it successfully completes, the next task can run. And there's kind of a basic schematic of our workflow over here on the right. One of the key things I want to emphasize now and will continue to do is that the scientific workflow tools don't require any changes to our application codes. So they are wrappers that sit outside the application code. So we're not editing our source code at all, right? These are just extra tools that help guide the execution of the applications you already have. So then once you have this task graph, then jobs are queued up to run. They get executed. When they succeed, the next jobs in your workflow get queued up and executed, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I said we're going to use these tools, but how do they actually help with the problems that I had previously identified? Well, one I said is automation, right? So with the workflow tools, jobs are automatically submitted as soon as they're ready to run, right? As soon as all the dependencies are satisfied, they're automatically submitted to execute. And that could be on the local system. It could be on the same system that's keeping track of how my workflow is doing, or it can be on a remote system. In fact, the workflow tools that we use even allow us to automatically submit jobs when the system requires two-factor authentication, which is kind of a neat trick and really handy because most clusters now do use 2FA. What about data management? Well, one of the things that workflow tools do is they will copy files around for you automatically. So for instance, they see that a job is the next one to run and it needs some input files. It will make sure that those input files have been copied into that directory and are ready to run. Conversely, when you're done, it will automatically copy output files that have been generated that you want to keep to your laptop or wherever you need it for long-term storage. How do they help with job execution? Well, as I mentioned, you can run jobs remotely. They will automatically submit jobs to clusters for you. They also support distributed execution, which is this idea that different jobs might run on different systems. And in fact, we've been using these capabilities to run my workflow on 14 different supercomputers since 2007. So we've really taken advantage of this capability to be able to run on lots of different remote resources. I'd also mentioned error recovery, right? So one of the things that the workflow tools do for us is if a job fails, it will be automatically retried in case the failure is something temporary, maybe a node went down or something. If that job keeps failing, then what will happen is the workflow tools will run everything else in the workflow that isn't dependent on the failed job, and then it will write a workflow checkpoint file. So you can then go fix the problem, come back, and restart your workflow from where you left off. And this is really useful, right? Because that way you're not redoing work you've already done, and you can identify exactly where the problems are. I just, again, over here on the right, kind of wanted to emphasize, right, that these workflow tools are sitting in a layer kind of between your scientific codes and the compute resources, that they're helping to manage, and the word they use a lot is orchestrate, right, like an orchestra, the execution of the jobs that you need to run in order to get your work done. I want to dive into a little more detail on two of these points to kind of give you a better sense as to like what's actually going on under the hood. So I mentioned that one of our big challenges is data management, right? We have those 420 million seismograms, and so we have lots of data files that are being consumed and produced. So Pegasus for us provides automatic what they call staging, and staging is just the moving around of data files to where they need to be. So for instance, I have a job that's about to run on a cluster. Pegasus will, if those files are available somewhere else in the cluster, Pegasus will automatically symlink those files into the execution directory. If they're available on a different machine, then Pegasus will automatically copy those files from the other system into where they need to be before launching the job that needs them. Then when I'm done, output files that I want to keep, I automatically transfer to an archive location. So we have those, kind of final scientific output data products permanently kept. This is really useful for running workflows on different systems. And this is something that we use, right? Because we have some GPU jobs and some CPU jobs. So one of the things that we do is we run the GPU jobs on a GPU-heavy system. Then Pegasus automatically copies those output files over to the CPU system for us so that when we're running our CPU-heavy jobs, those files are there and ready to be used. So having this automatic data transfer is really handy. Pegasus will also clean up temporary files, intermediate data products you don't need to help you stay under quota. And I know John was mentioning this in the parallel I/O session, that one of the issues with getting good performance in the file systems is not having too many files per directory. And so Pegasus has a mechanism for automatically setting up a directory hierarchy to keep the number of files per directory low. One of the other things we found is that sometimes we ended up with file system hiccups. So even though a file should have been written, and sometimes even though the code thinks that the file, fwrite returns the correct result, there's an issue with the buffer or something else and the file doesn't get written. And so we wanted to add some additional checks and make sure that the files looked right. So these were easy checks for us. Things like, do we have the right number of output files? Do they have nans in them? Because in our case, we knew that was a problem. Are they full of zeros, which was also kind of an error case we ran into? Are they the right size? We know in advance what some of the output file sizes will be. So what we did is we just created a new job, which would do these checks, and then we added it to our workflow. And then every time we run our workflow, right, that job just automatically gets run. And most of the time, right, the job runs, everything's fine, no big deal. But if it detects a problem with the files, then it aborts the workflow. And that's really useful, right? I mean, how many times have you maybe done several extra steps of processing on bad data, right? There was an issue, but you forgot to check or you missed it, and then 3 or 4 steps later, you realize you've been making images of nothing. And so this was a really easy, handy way for us to check for that. And now just every time we run the workflow, these checks are automatically performed, and we detect issues with files as soon as they happen rather than much later down the line. A second major challenge I want to dive into is that of job execution. So I mentioned that we have a lot of different job types in our workflow. We have serial and parallel jobs and CPU and GPU jobs. How do we actually get these jobs to run on a cluster somewhere using the workflow tools? For large parallel jobs, this is pretty straightforward. The workflow tools submit the job over the network to the batch scheduler. So for example, to the scheduler on Bridges 2. And this uses, there are a couple different tools use different things, but basically most of them use some variant on SSH. And so it just puts the job in the queue. It waits its turn like a normal job that you might submit using SBatch, starts up, runs, executes, and when it finishes, the workflow tool gets the exit code and figures out if it completed successfully or not. And so then this is pretty straightforward. You have access to all of the standard, like how long you want your wall clock time to be, are you running it on CPU or GPU nodes, etc. So running large parallel jobs is pretty straightforward. The workflow tools will also support kind of fancy knobs and dials you can turn. For instance, let's say that you have 10 node jobs that you're running. You could use the workflow tools to bundle them all, say you have 20 of them, to bundle these 20 10-node jobs into one single 200-node job. Sometimes, depending on the system you're running on and the scheduler policies, you can get better throughput if you take small jobs and you bundle them into large jobs. We've had a lot of success with our workflows doing this. What about the small serial jobs, though? What if I have a bunch of single core or even maybe a couple core jobs, but a bunch of small jobs that I need to churn through as quickly as possible? How can I do that? Well, as you probably already know, you can't necessarily put them all in the batch queue, right? I can't log into a system and submit 26 million short-running tasks into the scheduler. It would probably crash if I could do that. It's not designed for that scope of load. Scheduler cycles are usually on the order of several minutes. So if I have jobs that take maybe only a few seconds to run, the job will start up, it'll run, it'll finish, but now that node will hang idle for a while until the scheduler gets back around on its scheduler cycle. So most of the time I'm just waiting. Also, just practically, most systems have a per user limit as to how many jobs you can have in the queue. It's maybe 50 or 100. So it becomes clear pretty quickly that we can't just take our giant pile of tasks and dump them in the queue and hope that they will all come out the other end in a reasonable period of time. Okay, so what can we do then? So the workflow tool that we use, Pegasus, ships with a particular tool called Pegasus MPI Cluster, or PMC. And what this is this is an MPI wrapper around serial or thread parallel jobs. And it uses a manager worker paradigm. So the idea is you have a workflow that you want to run. You hand it off to PMC. It starts up an MPI job. The manager reads in your workflow, looks at all the tasks that need to be executed, and then hands those tasks out to the workers. When the workers finish, they call back and ask the manager for more work, and this just keeps going until all the tasks in your workflow are done. Since this is one MPI job, all that communication is being done through MPI messages. So this is very efficient, right? And it provides a way that you can, essentially run your entire workflow in a single MPI job. It preserves your dependencies, right? So even if you have a complex workflow, that's fine. And one of the things that I love about it most as an applications developer is that I don't have to do any of the hard stuff. All I have to do is tell Pegasus, hey, I want to run my workflow using this tool, and then everything else is taken care of, right? It starts up the MPI job. It already has all the code for dealing with the manager worker stuff. It knows how to parse my workflow. It knows how to do all this stuff. All I have to do is tell it I want to run in this mode. That's one of the things in general I really like about the workflow tools, right? As an applications developer, I'm not changing anything on my side. I'm just saying, hey, I want to use this feature, and then off it goes. They also let you do things like, if you know in advance, tell it how much memory you think each task is going to need. This is something that we've used because our tasks use quite a bit of memory. And so by telling it, then PMC kind of intelligently schedules the tasks so that you don't exceed the amount of available memory per node. And this is actually a feature that was developed for my group. We went to the Pegasus team and said, hey, we have this problem. We have millions of tasks we need to run in a quick and efficient way. Can you help us with that? And they said, yeah, let's think about this and we'll get back to you. And a couple of months later, they said, hey, we've developed this new tool. Can you give it a try? And this is very reflective of the kind of support that teams get from workflow tool developers. I've found that they're very eager to help. They're happy to work with you to understand your challenges and limitations and come up with ways to develop a solution. And even though this was originally created for us, since then, a lot of teams have started to use this because being able to run an entire workflow as a single self-contained MPI job is a pretty handy capability. So just to prove to you that you can actually do science with this, this is the required science glossy slide. About a year ago, we finished this series of simulations. It took us 95 days of around-the-clock execution, 24 hours a day. And so obviously, this is why you need automated tools, right? We used about 772,000 node hours on Summit, which was, I think, still the #1 system at the time. At peak, almost 3/4 of the entire system was being used to do our simulations, which we got without a reservation, I will add. We were just lucky. But I think that's pretty cool. That's kind of a personal high watermark in terms of number of cores that are churning on my work. The workflow tools submitted almost 30,000 jobs to run for us, managed 2.5 petabytes of data. Long-term archival storage was about 20 million files, about 75 terabytes. So that was automatically copied back to us to our long-term archive. And we calculated about 12.5 billion individual shaking values and inserted them into a local MySQL database. And so I think it is not an exaggeration to say that there's absolutely no way that we could do things at this scale without the help of the workflow tools. I also feel required to point out briefly on the science side, if you notice the hazard map, one of the things I always like to point out is how much variability there is. Right, if I'd asked you at the start of the day, so this is maybe, I think that box is about 100 kilometers by 180 kilometers. But if I'd asked you at the start of the day, is Southern California at risk due to earthquakes, you would have said yes. But you can see here from the map that it actually varies a great deal depending on where you are, and that's why we're doing this science work, is because it turns out that some areas are much more at risk than others, and this gives us a much better sense as to what parts those are. All right, so I've talked enough. It's your turn to talk. So what I want you all to do is I want you all to take a moment and think about what bottlenecks you're experiencing in your work that you think scientific workflow tools might be able to help you with. So take a moment and think about that, and then I want you to turn to a neighbor, and I want you to share with each other what those bottlenecks are. Go. All right, let's go ahead and come back. So who is willing to share something smart that their partner said? They said nothing smart. Who has something they'd like to share? What's a bottleneck that maybe their partner shared? Something that workflow tools might be able to help with. It's okay if you don't know exactly how they can help yet. At this point, I'm just kind of curious about the bottlenecks that you're identifying. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. There are actually workflow tools that are specifically designed for kind of machine learning and stuff, because the workloads are, there's specific characteristics for those kinds of workloads. Good. Anyone else have something they're willing to share? Yeah, in the back. Yeah, that's a good one. You have a need where you need to move data around kind of regularly, and you'd like to do it in an automated fashion, so it's, you don't have to log in and deal with it every time. That's good. Yeah, that's a great example. Any others? Yeah, support for like automatically resubmitting things, whether they've timed out or failed, but just having that support. Yeah, that's a great example. Parameter scans, parameter sweeps, anything where maybe you have a series of simulations you want to run, you're running the same code, but you have a bunch of different, you're doing some kind of parameter search. That's a great example. Yeah, kind of automatically moving things around, just making sure that, because like how many times have we all forgotten to do that, right? You finish a job somewhere and you're supposed to copy the files over and then make a visualization, but you forget to copy the files, you copy the wrong files, you copy them to the wrong directory, right? Like we've all done it. And so, yeah, having tools to help streamline that is good. Good. I appreciate those. Those are great examples of situations where this might help. And please, if you have a specific circumstance you're curious in talking more about, come and chat with me. I'd love to kind of get into details of your work and what your workload looks like. So I'm obviously making the argument today that these kind of bottlenecks are things that scientific workflow tools can help with. So this might not be a community you knew existed, but there is a mature community of tools out there. This has been an area of research for several decades. And so the people who work in this area have put a lot of thought into the problems that you encounter and ways that they can help with that. And so in order to be able to use these, you just have to be able to describe your work. And they support anything you can run on a computer, right? When they use the word task, they literally mean anything that you're running on a system. And so you express your work as a series of tasks with dependencies. If there are no dependencies, that's fine, right? A couple of the key concepts with workflows is that there's a separation between your workflow, your process, and the specific data you're running it on, right? You could run the same workflow multiple times, but on different sets of input data. There's also a separation between the process and the system you're running on, right? That you use the same process, and regardless of whether you run it on your laptop or on a cluster, the idea is you're running the same codes in the same order, but you might be able to run them on different systems. So fundamentally, right, this idea is that the workflow is describing your pipeline or your process independent of the specific data and independent of exactly what system you're running on. The tools provide all kinds of features and things to help address your bottlenecks. I'm not going to go into the fancy features today. I want to just kind of stick with a high-level overview. So I want to just discuss some of the basic concepts that workflow tools are using. So one is, right, you have to have some way to describe your workflow. Different tools use different approaches. You might use an API, so you might write code which describes what your workflow looks like. You could use Python annotations, for example, where you kind of annotate your functions to explain what their role is. You could use a GUI. Some tools, literally, you make a flow chart. You draw a box and then connect them with arrows, right? Different tools have different approaches for describing your workflow. Also, with the data roles, some tools you explicitly say, this is an input file, this is an output file. Other tools figure out what the data flow is based on how your tasks connect. Then you prepare your workflow to run on specific hardware. What I mean is at some point, right, if you want to run your application on Bridges 2, you need to provide what is the path to my executable, what specific, maybe I need to provide my account name when I submit the job to the queue, right? There's always some specific things, and so then the workflow tool adds those to get ready to run on a certain system. Then they schedule and run the workflow. So there's some kind of queue that the workflow tool has where it says, this job is ready to run. I will submit it to whatever resource it's running on. It will run, it will come back, and then it will submit the next job. So there's some way to do that. Many tools include support for remote job submission and data transfer. Some tools are good for interactivity. Some tools support like Jupyter Notebooks, for example. And also, all the tools do a good job of capturing metadata. What I'm talking about here are things like, what were the command line parameters? What were the inputs? When did it run? How long did it run for? What system did it run on? What were all the environment variables set to when it ran? All this kind of stuff gets captured automatically by the workflow tools. And then finally, there's some way that the user can monitor the workflow execution. And this may also include provision for error handling, for retrying automatically, workflow checkpoints, stuff like that. But these are the very common things that most workflow tools all share. They differ maybe a little on the details of exactly how they implement things or exactly how you work with these elements, but these are the basic high-level ideas. One thing I wanted to mention, a couple of years ago, the US National Academy of Sciences wrote a report on workflows. They call them automated research workflows. It's actually pretty readable. If you're into this kind of thing, you should go read it. But there are two quotes from there that I think are interesting, and I like to share when I'm talking with scientists about should they use workflows or not. The first is, why would you do this? And so they found that what they help with is, to accelerate scientific knowledge generation, potentially by orders of magnitude, while achieving greater control and reproducibility in the scientific process. Because what you're doing is you're automating things, right? And so you're taking the human out of the loop, and you're making the work much more efficient. The second thing they highlighted is that by using these workflow tools, you get better tracking results, recording data, establishing provenance, and creating more consistent metadata than even the most dedicated researchers can provide themselves. So politely, they're telling you that no matter how good of a job you think you're doing at capturing your metadata, the scientific workflow tools can do a better job. Because fundamentally, it's automated, right? You don't have to remember to do it. And this is so useful for so many things, right? Obviously for reproducibility, to be able to go back and see exactly what you ran. For tracking bugs, right? You find a bug and you're like, oh shoot, was that a problem in those runs I did 3 weeks ago? Well, you gotta go back, you gotta find the input files, you gotta find the log files. But with the workflow tools, this is all captured automatically. This has certainly been a big help to our team, right? That you find an issue and then you can very quickly go back and say, okay, what did I run with? Oh yeah, that run is fine, but this run is not. So that is another nice thing that the workflow tools provide. I just want to mention a couple of popular tools that are out there. There are many tools. If you have a specific use case, come chat with me. I'm just going to highlight a few here. I mentioned that I use Pegasus. Pegasus was developed at the University of Southern California. It's used in a variety of science domains. I think it's probably most famous for the LIGO project, right? The one that found the gravitational waves. They use Pegasus. With Pegasus, the idea is that the workflows are executed from a local system. That could be like your laptop or a server that kind of keeps track of the workflow. But then jobs can be sent wherever. They can run locally, or they can go off and run on remote clusters. So we run jobs both locally on our workflow server, but then also on multiple clusters. You describe your workflow by using an API. They recommend the Python API, but they also have support for R and Java. So you use code to say, this is a task, this is another task, this task is a child of this task, meaning it has to run after the other task. And then you also use your code to describe files and roles. Pegasus then creates a YAML format file which describes all this, right? Takes the results from the API, writes it to a file. One limitation they have is that the workflow has to be represented by a directed acyclic graph. So you can't have loops in your dependency tree. This is less of a limitation than it sounds like. It's actually very unusual for someone's process to really involve loops. But if it does, there are other tools out there that are cool with loops. Another popular tool is Parcel. It's developed at the University of Chicago in collaboration with Argonne National Lab. And so Parcel allows you to parallelize Python, and I don't mean like multi-thread Python, but rather run multiple tasks that aren't dependent all at the same time by providing annotations to either Python functions themselves or Python functions that wrap external applications. And I kind of have an example down here with this like bash app annotation. And so it integrates well with Jupyter Notebooks, and you have these annotations, and then you link the outputs of some with the inputs of the other, and then that's how it puts together your workflow. The focus of this one is on large data simulations and also on many tasks. So if you have kind of a high throughput workflow, that's one of the things that they focused on. eFlows for HPC is another one. It's out of Barcelona Supercomputing Center. And so this is they're assembling kind of a large platform that puts together different individual workflow software elements. So for example, PyComps is the one that's responsible for the actual runtime execution. Some people even use that independently. The idea here is it's kind of a workflows as a service paradigm. Some other ones, SnakeMake. I think Sarah mentioned this in the panel on Tuesday. This one's international, but most of the maintainers I think are based in Europe. And so they have extended Python, and you use that extension of Python to create rules that explain how to create outputs from inputs, right, by running some kind of executable or a function or something. It integrates well with Conda and also with containers, and one of the things that they focused on is support for dynamic workflows, workflows that evolve and change like while you're running the code. Makeflow is another one out of Notre Dame. This uses a makefile type syntax to describe your workflow. So the idea is that the target is the output file, it's dependent on the input files, and then the string is the thing you need to run in order to generate those output files from these input files. Makefile type syntax is not necessarily my jam, but a lot of people like it. They also ships with a specific tool they call work queue, which allows you to manage the worker pool, manage like your available computational resources really effectively. So you can pull in nodes from multiple clusters and be able to run jobs on those. That pool of workers can easily grow and shrink, and it can keep track of these things. And so that's a strength of this tool. The last one I'm going to mention is Nextflow. It's currently being developed by Sequeira Labs in Barcelona, which is a company, but it is an open source tool. And so it uses a data flow paradigm. So the idea is that tasks read and write from channels, which can be files, but they don't have to be files. And you describe your workflow with a custom scripting language. This one I've also focused on good integration with containers. You notice some trends here in the names, right? You should go off and create a workflow tool called Snakeflow. I think that's the only one we don't have. But hopefully this gives you a basic sense that, yeah, the details of each tool are a little different, but fundamentally they're fulfilling the same roles. So if you're interested in looking at tools that might work for your work, feel free to give one of these a try if it sounds good, or if you're not sure, feel free to contact me and I'm happy to help. But what about Python scripts, right? You might say, well, some of these things sound handy, but couldn't I just do some of this myself, right? Couldn't I just write some Python scripts to copy files around? And yes, absolutely you could, right? You can reproduce some of these features. For instance, some of you may know that Slurm supports job dependencies, right? You can submit a job to Slurm. You can submit a second job and say, only run this second job if the first job finishes successfully, right? Absolutely. You can also have it send you email notifications when it's done, right? So you don't have to keep checking to see what the status is. You could also, without too much trouble, implement kind of automatic retry, right? If the job has a failure exit code, then you could resubmit it. And you could certainly copy files around, right? Absolutely, that these are things that you can replicate on your own. So let me ask, what do you think are the pros and cons? When is it good to use an established tool? When do you think it's good to just kind of write a Python script on your own? What are your thoughts? Yeah, in the back. Sure, if it's something pretty small, then yeah, then it may make sense to just kind of do it on your own rather than bringing in the extra overhead of a tool. Sure. What are other thoughts? That's true. The established workflow tools are probably a little easier if you're worried about kind of portability, right? We all know that when Python scripts start to get complicated, sometimes it's hard to hand it off to somebody else and have them, right? The maintaining there can be tricky. So that's true, thinking about kind of what's the user base and, yeah, how well established is your workflow. Yeah. Yeah, if things are changing, your custom scripts are sometimes a bit more fragile because, right, oftentimes you've coded them more specifically for like your use case. And so if there are small changes, you may need to go back and do extra development. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. That's exactly the trade-off that you're considering, right? Is that there's always additional overhead when you bring in a new tool, right? You have to figure out how to integrate it and you have to learn how it works. And so, exactly, you have to do that cost-benefit analysis of, does bringing in the new tool give me enough of an advantage that it's worth doing? And so, my takeaway here is not actually that there's a right answer. I know you probably think my argument is that you should always use the workflow tool all the time, and that's not actually what I'm going to say. My argument is you should try to automate everything more than you are. That absolutely is an argument that I will make. The best approach to that is something that you'll have to figure out for your own workload. The one thing I will leave you with is don't write your own scientific workflow tool. You might start writing Python scripts and, oh, now I need to run more jobs, and now I need to transfer more files, and I want to support being able to run the jobs on a couple of different clusters. And then suddenly you turn around and you've got a couple thousand lines of code and you've essentially written your own scientific workflow tool. Don't do that, right? So if you decide to do the custom approach, totally fine, but also, continue to check periodically, and if it starts to spiral out of control, say, okay, wait a minute, we're getting to the point that we should use a tool that's developed by people for whom this is their full-time job, who have a lot of experience, and who can help me sort through thorny issues that I'm now starting to encounter. There we go. So what have we learned today? So we learned, maybe for the first time, that workflow tools exist, right? That this is a whole realm of software that is out there and that is designed to help you. And one thing that's kind of neat about it is we spend a lot of this week talking about ways to improve computational efficiency, right? We talk about ways to optimize code, to parallelize it, and have it scale better. But this here, what we're talking about, are ways to optimize your efficiency, right? It's ways to make it that you are spending less time kind of doing manual tasks and more time doing the kind of higher level science work, right? And that's fundamentally the point of these workflow tools, is to help you work through these bottlenecks and improve your overall efficiency. We learned that they work with any computational tasks. Anything that you run in a computer, you can put in a workflow. And they don't require changes to your application codes, right? Again, this is something that exists as a wrapper outside your application codes. And this is really important to us too, right? The seismologists that I worked with have worked very hard to tweak their wave propagation codes, and they don't want other tools messing with that. So that was important to us too. We learned that these tools can help us to manage jobs, right? The execution of jobs, even across multiple systems, manage our files, making sure that the input files are in the right places and that the output files are transferred to the right places, and also capture our metadata automatically. So that way, whether it's to help support reproducibility later, or when it's time to write the paper, or when we find a bug, these things have been automatically captured for us. We don't have to worry about trying to remember what parameters we ran with several months ago. We also learned that they have this concept of separating the process that you want to execute from the data that you're running on. This helps us with distributed execution. It means we can run different parts of our workflow on different systems. It makes it easy to take our same workflow and just move it to a new machine. It also makes it easy to explain your process to new users, right? A new grad student comes in, you're trying to explain, look, these are the computational things we have to run. Well, it's easy, right? You pull out the workflow and you say, hey, look, let me show you. We run this, and then we run these two jobs, and they do this. These are the files that get created. It makes it very easy. And this is one of the intensive workflows as well, is that when you have this workflow description, it's easy to hand it off to somebody else in your lab, or even, somebody somewhere else. Some of the communities that use workflow tools, in fact, have kind of robust mechanisms for sharing their workflows with other members of the community. I'm going to leave you with a couple of closing thoughts. So one, and this is really one of my big takeaways here, is that automation is vital. Whether or not you end up using any of these workflow tools, I encourage you to think about your work and think about additional ways you can automate what you're doing. So first of all, eliminate human polling, right? You submit the job. You check to see if it's run. You check to see if it's run. You check to see if it's run. You go to bed. You get up in the morning. You check to see if it's run. Oh, it did finish. So now I go and I check the output files. Does it look like it ran okay? It does look like it ran okay. So now I submit the next job. You don't need to do any of that, right? By automating it, you have it set up so that, you run the job, and then the next job gets started automatically, and the next job gets started automatically. And instead of spending all that time checking, you can go off and do something else. Sleep. Sleep is good. Then you want to get it so that everything can run automatically if successful, right? That you hit go, and then every processing step you need to run runs until it spits out at the end. And kind of the next step beyond that is to start thinking about how can I deal with common errors. And this is the point at which, if you're using kind of custom scripts and stuff, you might really want to say, if I'm ready to do this, maybe I should start looking at a larger tool. Because once you start dealing with error recovery and stuff, things start to get a little thorny. But I encourage you to just think about your work and think about what are other ways that I can automate the things that I'm doing. Along with this, you want to put all the processing steps that you have to do in the workflow. If you have to validate something, put that in the workflow. You want to make visualizations. You need to publish something to a website. You've got to send an email to your advisor and tell them that the workflow is done. Whatever it is, put it in the workflow, because anything that isn't in the workflow quickly becomes a bottleneck. You leave the visualization out, and now everything's run, but you don't have any pictures, and you have a bunch of stuff queued up, and now you're trying to do it yourself. So you put it in the workflow, right? Again, it's this mentality of trying to automate as much as possible. So when you hit go, you have everything you need. I was talking to Elsa about this earlier this week, and she said, she was telling someone essentially, you want it so that when you're done with your workflow, the nice little glossy PowerPoint slide pops out that you can take to a funding agency and get funded. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Avoid premature optimization. Donald Knuth famously said that premature optimization is the root of all evil. And I think that sometimes is a good mentality to have. So, right, if you want to use a workflow, first, get everything in the workflow, get everything to run in the workflow correctly, and then worry about kind of turning the knobs and making the tweaks to get it to run as fast as possible. But, don't start there. Start by getting it to run first, getting it to run right, and then worry about getting it to run fast. Because the workflows are easy to take between systems, you can consider new compute environments, right? It's easy to take, you can take the same description of your work and move from your laptop to your lab cluster, to your departmental cluster, to your university system, to one of the resources that's provided by people here to, Fugaku, right? You can take the same description of your workflow and scale it up as far as you want. And I hope, too, showing you the numbers from my simulations helps to make the argument that these workflow tools really can run jobs at very large scales. And finally, the tool developers want to help you, right? Their success is predicated on whether or not people can use their tools to do good science. So they very much are interested in supporting people who are trying to use their tools to do science. I mentioned that I've had a really positive experience working with the tool developers, telling them what my issues are. A lot of the tools also have very active user communities. You can join them on Slack and say, like, hey, I'm trying to get started, I'm having this problem. People will be happy to jump in and help you. Relatedly, I am also happy to jump in and help you. And I know what's going to happen. I've been here before. You're going to say, okay, this is a good idea. Scott's got some good points. I should consider that. You're going to go home. It's summer. You're on holidays. Then it's fall. School year starts up. Then maybe October rolls around. And you're like, you know what? I should give this a try. You pick one of these tools, you get started, and you get stuck. And you think, I should email Scott. But it's been too long. I can't email Scott. It'll be too weird. It will not be too weird. I promise you this. I don't care how many years it's been. If you're working on stuff and you've got questions, please feel free to contact me anytime. I see Ludovic nodding, so you can take him up on that offer as well. So I realized I don't think I've updated the slides on the Moodle, so I will do that. But these are links to everything that I talked about today. And this is my concluding slide with the logos of my funding agencies and the systems that we did use to run the work. Thank you very much.